Steph Spencer, welcome to the Lyle podcast. It's so great to be with you today. It's nice that we get to be together over Zoom. So for people that watch this video on YouTube, they'll get to see our faces, and those listening. But it's so great to be here. I love technology because my understanding is that you are in a wintry state in Minnesota right now.
Yes, our climates are quite different at the moment.
Yeah. So I love this tech that we get to be here and kind of have this conversation. We can get right into it. So my first question for you is, how would you describe your work and your vocation? So introduce yourself a little bit, but this is kind of where we're going. How would you describe your work and vocation?
Um, yeah, that question can be surprisingly complex to answer. I think even
Mhm.
I think for most people that's probably true. Even if you have a job title, that might not feel like it quite describes who you are and what's yours to bring to the world. So in terms of job titles, I have two of them. So one world that I live in is I co-lead a nonprofit called 40 Orchards, and we engage people in what we call scripture circles, where a lot of people's religious experience has been having someone talk at them about what they should think or what they should do. And in scripture circles, we have communal conversations, learning from the wisdom of the room, still centered on the scriptures, but also centered on one another and what we have to bring, what our life experience says, and how we can learn and see one another's perspectives. So that's one world. The other world is enneagram coaching. And so
Mhm.
Enneagram's been a tool that's been around for a long time. I've been coaching for this year makes 7 years. And I find that it's a really helpful tool to help people understand themselves and each other. Again, understand those perspectives that we bring to the table. And so I would say when I think about who I am, the commonality of those two worlds for me really feels like this place of bringing language to the human experience, giving us a way
Mm.
to talk about things that are hard to talk about. Like we want to have deep conversations with each other, but sometimes we don't know how. And both of these provide ways to do that, of ways to talk about things that we're afraid of, things that make us feel vulnerable, and ask better questions of our lives and of one another. And that's the part of both that I love is I just spend a lot of my time asking questions. Whether it's coaching or in scripture circles as I facilitate, I just ask a lot of questions and see what happens as we explore. And usually don't find answers. We usually just find more questions. But that to me is a
Mhm.
part of the fun of let's keep asking and wondering and diving in.
Yeah, I love this. And so we kind of go back a ways. I'd have to think like how old we are. So kind of college years, right, in Wisconsin. And but we've had a big gap in kind of connecting. And so we've been, doing our own things. But I sense anyway, kind of a synergy, which is why I have you on this on the podcast. I'm excited and I'm like grinning already. Like if you can't, hopefully you hear it in my voice if you're not watching my face, but I think I'm just super excited to learn from you today and to have these conversations. So I think it's going to be very meaningful. Thanks for that description of what you do. I have a few follow-up questions if that's okay.
Yeah.
So when you say scripture circles, like what scripture are you referring to? I'm assuming it's a biblical text or but are because there's lots of scriptures.
Yeah, it is the biblical text. I primarily the group of people that studies are Christians, but we also we spend a lot of time in the Hebrew Bible. That
Mm,
is a part of the Christian Bible. We just sometimes forget that that's two-thirds of the story,
right.
and has existed for a really long time. And the method of study that we use is a method of study that I learned from a Jewish rabbi that I was able to study with. His name's Alan. And it sort of opened up this world of, we call it midrash. We use the term midrash. That term's been around for a long time, which just asks a whole set of questions I didn't know we were allowed to ask.
Yeah.
And so it does also engage in, it's not only Christians who study with us. Some people would maybe describe themselves as more like on that deconstructing realm of faith where they might not use the term Christian for themselves anymore, but they still believe in God and are looking for a way to center on something in the
Hmm.
Bible, it makes sense to them, but they just want to hold it differently. We do have people who come into our rooms who are Jewish and also resonate with this way of study from the Jewish perspective. Um, but primarily Christian. People identify as Christian, and then that the Bible is the text that we're around.
So yeah, that sounds even more incredible as you explain more of it. Can we follow that a little bit, like that trail?
Sure.
Because I'm trying to lean into curiosity. We talked a little bit about that. I want to ask good questions and things. So I'm very curious because I don't know, jealous and envy. They're different things. I don't know which one's the right word, but that sounds very interesting to have that experience with a rabbi. And um, I've definitely become more open to other, like wisdom from other sources as I've gone kind of through the years. I, I have so many questions. Like one is like, how did that come to be? Did you seek it out, or was it, you know, something that maybe you kind of like asked for, like prayed for, and then like it came for? I'm like a little curious about just how that came to be.
It sort of fell into my lap in certain ways. So he still is a traveling rabbi. He
Mm.
goes all over the world really and has different study communities there. And somebody who's in Minneapolis had encountered him actually in Ireland and said, I would like to introduce people in Minneapolis to this way of study, and started gathering people in her living rooms way back in, I think 2009 is when that started, which is before I came into a room. And then I was a pastor here and ended up invited into a room, and I knew somebody who was there who invited me in. As these things happen, it was that sort of realm. And then and it was sort of informal like that for a bit, but then it that was a part of the rumblings of might this be something more than just him. And so it was out of those sort of informal studies in a living room that this idea of 40 orchards was born, of like, what if this actually is a nonprofit engaging in this way of study in the world in a more conscious way. And it sort of converged in my own life where the church that I was a part of, for a lot of reasons, it wasn't a fit. It was really painful experience.
Mm.
And it was a time for me to leave that. And I left into
Mhm.
this liminal space. And in the liminal space was the same time that the sort of question was arising in the study community. And so then 40 Orchards was born in January of 2016. So we're now 6 years that this has been going on as its own thing. And in those early years, it really was still very much centered around Rabbi Allen and his studies, but we started to do more. We started to do some programs. I started teaching more, and it's morphed and changed over time. Where actually Allen doesn't even come to Minnesota anymore. He's focused on some other things that he does in other areas. So he helped birth this, but now I teach. I'm the primary teacher, and then I co-lead with Lisa, who also teaches. Sarah teaches. So we've become a female-led
Ah,
nonprofit, which is its
yeah.
own sort
All
of
right. Snaps.
goodness in
Yeah,
the
there you go.
world,
Yeah,
right?
yes, absolutely.
But it's not how it began.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
in its next iteration. And I expect there'll be another iteration down the road. And part of it is just letting all of that unfold. So it hasn't been a plan or a path. It's just sort of been a next step each time, opening up what's here.
Thank you. I'd love for you to explain a little bit about some of the questioning in midrash. Like that's a word. So I do have, personally, I have this interest in learning more about Judaism, um, and I get these words, but I can't really hang on to them. So that
Yeah.
I know I've heard of midrash before, and I know that also that's a beautiful part of Jewish tradition, is like this capacity to engage God in questions, which it wasn't necessarily like doubt in questions, which wasn't particularly my upbringing in Christian roots or evangelical Christianity. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what midrash is and what kind of questioning that opens up for you or for people? You can talk about it however you want to.
Yeah. I mean, one place to begin with that is just to name that Judaism is not a monolithic religion or background, and so people would interpret midrash differently or have different experiences with it. And there's so not everybody who would use the term the same way I'm using the term. And there's a capital M midrash and a lowercase m midrash. So capital M midrash is actually referring to a particular set of documents that ancient rabbis put together that's like their commentaries on the scripture. And so people can quote those midrash documents from a really long time ago. So that's midrash with a capital M. But midrash with a lowercase m is still the tradition of doing what those rabbis did. And what those rabbis were doing was they were assuming that what was not written down was actually also a part of the story of scripture. So even some of the ideas of the white space is as valuable as the black letters. What's not there that's in the scroll, and why was that left out, and what sort of room is there for us to wonder about those things, and why, and the assumption that when things aren't said, they're not said on purpose, and when they are said on purpose, and to let the next questions unfold with that. So it's even developed into a tradition where there's an acronym to go along with midrash with the lowercase
Okay.
m of what that means, using different Jewish terms. So the first letter with it is P, which is for Peshat. And that is this like simple layer of questions. So it's a word that means simple. And it's this sort of obvious, like, how old are people? Where is this taking place? Some of those factual kind of questions of the text. And then there's remez. Remez means now I'm like blanking. I think that one's hidden. Now I want to pull it up to get my words right.
Yeah.
But it's this idea that there's something underneath those obvious things. There's trajectories to look at. There's ways that stories tie into another story. So that layer might look at something like, okay, in Genesis 12, Abram is called out from his native land, his kindred, his father's house, to go to a place that God would cause him to see. Well, what does it mean to see? Where else have we seen seeing in scripture, and how does that inform what we think it means for him to see? Are we talking physical eyes? Are we talking spiritual eyes? Well, let's go back to Genesis 1. The first time that a being sees something is when God looks at creation and sees that it is good. What does that tell us about what it means to see and what Abram is being invited into? So that's then, the Peshat layer is saying, who is Abram? Who is his father? Where is he? He's in Ur of the Chaldeans. The Remez layer is saying, what does it mean to see? Let's take it to that level. Then the Deresh layer is the D, and Deresh is the verb that's at the root of midrash, and Deresh means to seek. So seeking takes that question even further. Well, what does it mean for Abram to be asked to leave everything he's ever known to go towards the thing that God will show him? What does that mean about what that moment in time is? When, as humans, have we had that moment in time where we've asked to take that kind of step of faith? How did we feel? Would we have said yes? Did we say no? What does it mean for him to be leaving his family behind in the ancient world, which is a whole nother ball game? What would that mean for us? Deresh, I think, especially of questions where the human experience encounters it, I think that there's a lot of narratives in the first 5 books of the Bible in particular, in the Torah, that we're meant to see ourselves inside of the characters that are in it. They're archetypes of humanity in certain ways, and that there's a bunch of questions, if we look for them, that are there. If we look at Jacob, what does it mean to wrestle for your identity? How many of us have had that experience of feeling like we had to wrestle all night for a name that was ours? That's a human question. It's Jacob's question. It's also our question. So Deresh is really getting at those layers of things. And then there's the layer of Sud. Sud is secret. And so that gets into a more mystical layer. I would say that we go there. I think there's a minority of people that really feel comfortable playing there in the deep mystical places, because that might be looking at things like the mystical meanings of Hebrew letters. It might be getting at some, like, this idea that there's really some subtext that is deeper. But even there's permission to ask. Like, one of the things I say about questions is, like, what are we afraid of by asking the question? Does it hurt to wonder about those things? Where does it lead us to wonder about those things? And there's a way that each of those layers sort of helps root the other. Like, one of the reasons we think about something like Peshat in that obvious or simple layer is to say Abram does have an age in Genesis 12. Whatever Genesis 12 can mean a lot of things, but Abram is 75. Now we can still take it to that Sud layer and say, what does the number 75 symbolically mean in scripture? That's going to take it mystical, but we're not making him 100. We're not changing things. We're still rooted in something, even as we go to a mysticism and a depth. And then that together spells pardes, PRDS, which is the Hebrew word for orchard. And so that's even a part of 40 Orchards is thinking about how there's an orchard of questions that is really fills something out with beautiful fruit as we study it with our lives.
Whoa, everybody, right? So Steph is a teacher. Can you hear it? That was great. Sorry, my dog right now is having a wonderful dream. So if you hear some interesting noises, Wilmer is having a good dream state. That's so cool. I've been like jotting down notes as we go. Thank you so much for that that overview. I'm kind of interested in like a little rabbit trail on the Sud, like the secret, like the mystical. That's an area that I guess feel comfortable in on some level. Like I'm sure there's things I'm like, okay, that's a little out there, but I just think well, because mystical, like the definition I understand is kind of just like a lived experience of God, right? It's like just like that belief that like you can encounter God directly. And I definitely am like, yeah, I think so. And I think I've had that. Look like you wanted to say something.
Oh, go ahead to finish.
No. Go ahead. Was there something? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that even how you just said that, I think it's a realm a lot of us can play in and know that we don't have to go all the way into those waters. Like we can decide that's as far as I'm willing to go into the mystical. Beyond this feels a little too far for me.
Yeah.
But it's a big pool. And so for a lot of people, like we think about numbers when we're doing things and the meaning of numbers, and to say, okay, what does it mean that this number 40 keeps getting repeated in the scriptures?
Right.
Like that doesn't seem coincidental.
Yep.
What's happening with the number 40? And actually, a lot of us, if we follow that pattern, would say that's a mystical realm I feel comfortable playing in because, gosh, it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. The people are in the wilderness for 40 years. Even then in the New Testament, Jesus goes out to the wilderness for 40 days.
40 days, exactly.
And Elijah is on a journey for 40 days. Goliath taunts the people for 40 days.
It's not 39, it's not 42.
Always 40. And to say, what if actually that is tied to the human experience of the gestational age of humans, and to say
I just
even
got
the
chills.
ancient people recognized 40 weeks as an important time. And what if in all of those stories of 40, something is dying and something new is being born? Because that pattern seems to be there, like in Noah's Ark, something is dying, but it's because something is being born.
Yeah.
And even when we're talking about Jesus, like his way of life as a quiet carpenter is dying because he comes out of the wilderness and starts his ministry. There's something being born out of that time of 40. Well, those are mystical waters, but gosh, that feels true.
Yeah.
I can think of lots of times things have died in my life and are reborn. And so then we play with that. Like we have a cohort program and we make it 40 weeks long.
There you go. Good.
Why not play with that?
Why not? Exactly. Yeah. I'm totally with you. I think for certainly like in my upbringing, and I still have to deal with it, right? Is like a negative perception of mysticism, which is really sad because if mysticism is just direct like experience of God, like I think that's such a profound longing of the heart to believe that you can connect to God directly. And I am all for in my own life. Yeah. Like what is that next step? What is that like less? I always feel like it's an invitation. So what's that next invitation? So I think the invitation can be just simply because you can say, okay, I just prayed that I would have food for today or something, and then somebody left something on a doorstep, and you could say like that's God, that's a direct experience of God answering your prayer, right? Or that request, if you don't say prayer, like a longing or a desire or whatever you kind of like say, but or you can just be like, well, that's serendipity or that's a coincidence. Or in my experience, like the more that I consider that this is an experience with the we could say supernatural, but it's just like it's just like a greater understanding of the world. It's not like separate from our nature. It's kind of like interacting with just the forces that are kind of all around us. I'm talking and not asking a question.
Well, but that's okay. I think one of the things I think about when you're talking is I think that a lot more than we realize as humans goes back to this question of what are we afraid of?
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of ways that we are afraid and we are protecting ourselves, and systems are afraid and systems are
Yeah.
protecting
Absolutely.
themselves. So
1000%. Yeah.
the reality is, I think many of us who grew up more afraid of those of doubt or mysticism or more vulnerable questions has to do with the fact that we're a part of systems that we're afraid of losing control. Because
Yes.
if we go into those
Mm-hmm.
deeper questions, we go into the mysticism, then we're sort of walking out of some of their control of how we understand who God is, where we're getting our teaching from. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
self-protection that is a part of a lot of
Yep.
religious
Yep.
institutions and people afraid of losing control. And so therefore don't go into mysticism.
Okay. She's going there. She's going there, folks. Yeah. I agree. But I think there's like an unlearning, right, that needs to happen based on your exposure. So your exposure could have either been negative, like don't do that because of control, or you could just had a more um, like agnostic, but not really particularly curious, like towards like trending towards like atheism, or just, having like a very materialistic like upbringing that just like what you see is what you get. There's not there's not things behind the curtain. So I think there's like for so many of us, just that invitation to what if I did just consider that there was like some meaning behind this? What if I feel like that just really opens up so much. And I'm glad that I was curious as you were sharing about midrash, and that's so Pardes, is that what you said, the
Mhm.
acronym? Yeah. Tried to write it out phonetically so I could when you got to Sued and that secret, I was just like, is 40 acres, like, is this like a mystical kind of thing, that belief in numbers and like the significance and like kind of belief that you're connecting to that, right? Because there's like a participating, you're, instead of like viewing, I think mysticism is a little bit like is not viewing yourself separate from things,
Mhm.
but like that you are directly participating so you can receive, and then when you can receive, then you have something to give. You're just like participating.
Mhm. And what that might be another place that fear comes into play is some of us weren't raised with the capacity to trust ourselves, or this question
Yeah.
of how do we see God and how do we see ourselves? And this place of, do we think that God would trust us to be a part of the story? Or do we think that we're sort of so sinful, or whatever word you want to use, that like we can't be trusted with something? Mysticism means that we have to trust that God is communicating. We also have to trust that we can hear it. And sometimes that
Yes.
has to do more with our own view of ourselves and whether
Mm-hmm.
we believe we're co-creating a life with a
Yep.
mystical,
Yep.
divine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we don't think that we have the capacity for that. Sometimes we've also been hurt. I just want to also leave space for those who've been hurt by a more mystical tradition or a more spirit driven tradition, different
Right.
language, because sometimes it's also been
Mm-hmm.
used for harm. And that's why it has
Yeah.
felt far away, is that people say, God
Sure.
said, God told me to do
Yes.
this, can be a very
Yes.
harmful thing. And so
Yes.
there's fear around that too. What if I'm
Yeah.
wrong? What if I hurt somebody?
Mm-hmm.
Because people have been hurt by that being abused. And so it is, maybe if we keep with that picture of it's a pool you can swim in, it is good to know how to swim. It is good to kind of to be conscious of what it is to swim in those waters, and how people have been hurt by them or afraid of them. And one of the guardrails that I think of that we have in 40 Orchards is we're doing this work in community. And
Okay.
so there's people in a room where I'm facilitating a conversation. I'm going to ask a question, but a room is going to answer the question,
Mm.
which means there's ways that we have to say things that work in community and that community
Mm.
bears witness to it. And there's a way that that becomes a part of the wisdom. It also becomes a part of it's less me in my closet coming out and saying, God told me to go do this, because that's often where the harm has been.
Mm. Mhm.
In community, we're sort of we're witnessing one another as we bring forward what we see about the text. And that
Mhm.
often is just very
Mhm.
life-giving and very, I
Yeah.
just had a study this morning and we were definitely learning from each other. We got to this whole place at the tail end of the conversation about like this deep question of what it is to co-create with God and whether God sort
Mhm.
of, quote unquote, changes God's mind based on what we bring forward.
Mhm.
And it was beautiful and it was deep and it was brought forth by the people that were in the room, not, I ask a question, but then the things take on a life of their own in community in a beautiful way.
You're right. Yeah, I love that. I think of that as like such a gift that you're giving, right? Because you're like holding space for this conversation. You're holding space for this conversation and it's not a top down, like, here's what you should get out of it, right? But I'm going to just create this space and I'm going to allow you to trust and move in this space. And we'll kind of explore that together. I'm so thankful for you giving like a bigger kind of context and picture of the different experiences that people can have. And I think it also highlights wisdom. Can I use the W word of like, of that things aren't just like black and white, right? That there's nuance and there's yeah, I don't know. I would be hard to define wisdom, I guess is kind of where I'm trying to say. But I think that's what you're uh getting into. And I think that's actually a risk and something in my experience of learning to hear God's voice. Like that's what I believe is kind of happening. Um, I feel like you learn from the results. So in like the Christian tradition, we talk about bearing fruit. So if I make okay, I think I hear God, and then I do what's like the consequences of that? What's the like if I believe that I received this, and if we use like a more universal language, like I receive an energy, and then I have it, and then I can either just like hang on to it, or I can decide to like impart it and let it out, right? So if I believe I receive something and I let it out, we can pass on negative energy, right? Or we can pass on positive. So I feel like learning to hear God's voice, there's like a trust because there's a like in that wisdom, you have to like learn and grow to hear God's voice. I think most traditions talk about needing to be quiet and needing to be still and like listen to hear that. And so, what's that versus what are just the thoughts in our head that are like banging around or that are ego driven? So I'm so glad you bring that up. If there's anything else you want to say about that.
Well, I think that, I mean, the ego driven sort of starts to get into the enneagram
Yeah, let's go
world that
there.
I'm
That's perfect.
into.
Let's just yeah.
Well,
So
but to go
yeah.
back to before we go there, I want to
Okay.
think about like one of the things that comes to mind with the wisdom of community, and what we do with 40 Orchards is that like even as an organization, we are co-led. I lead with my friend Lisa. Lisa does a lot of work inside the prison system. So when she is bringing her wisdom into a room, she's often bringing the voice of the incarcerated into the room, which brings this whole other piece of wisdom that we often wouldn't have access to because I'm not in
Yeah.
the prison. So to be
Yeah.
in this, and what was sparking this thought was you said like to be quiet to hear God's voice. There's a way that I actually push a bit in what I do and what we do at 40 Orchards. Not I wouldn't say against the idea of a quote unquote quiet time that people grew up with in evangelicalism, but there's often this pressure that we feel that I'm supposed to hear from God by myself. I'm supposed to sit down at this designated time that I have set aside to read the Bible and journal. I'm supposed to hear wisdom from God that I take out into my life. That's a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And not that times like that aren't valuable, but there's this way of saying, what if we just have a conversation and ask some questions and hear how God shows up in the conversation
Mm-hmm.
through one another's voices? Like, if we really
Mm-hmm.
believe that we are the image of God on earth, do we believe that God speaks through other humans and through the
Yeah.
wisdom and lived experiences that they have? And can we hear God's voice in that conversation, not just when we're by ourselves and quiet?
Yeah.
And also when we're by ourselves and quiet. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, but I think that that even helps with that non-binary thinking that you're leading to, because
Mm-hmm.
we can hear um, people saying, oh, I hear this in the passage, and someone else saying, I hear this in the passage, and seeing how they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And we can hold the possibility of both things being the case. Things like, I hear the tone of voice I hear God speaking with in this passage is this. Someone else says, oh, I hear it this way. The passage doesn't tell us the tone of voice. We can't say one of those is right, one of those is wrong, but we can then wonder, gosh, if God is speaking gently in this, how do I hear it? If God is speaking harshly, how do I hear it? How can I wonder if sometimes it's either, it's a different kind of conversation to have. And I do think community helps free us from those ego messages that we want to tell ourselves. And that becomes a part of hearing God's voice in that way is our egos have to operate a little differently in order to listen well.
Yeah. So let's transition into the Enneagrams. Thank you so much for that. As we talk about a little bit of your other work, is 40 acres something that people can do like worldwide, or do they need to be in Minneapolis to be doing this?
For 40 orchards.
Orchards. Oh, thank you.
But do you know what's so funny about that? I hope you don't mind me saying
like my Caedmon's call kind of.
Yes, I was going to say, like, I feel like people from our generation there's a particular generation of people that almost always end up calling it 40 acres because of the Caedmon's Call album.
Oh, it's true. And I wrote down 40 orchards, but I didn't. I thought I had it. I'm so for those that share that experience, you can laugh. If you don't know what we're talking about, then just go ahead and fast forward. 40 orchards. So for 40 orchards, do people need to be physically present with you, or is there
we have both in-person studies and we have Zoom. I mean, even just this morning's study, there was somebody who was joining us from Germany.
Love it
when the time zone works. Even that's a minority. Most people are from the US, but 40orchards.org is our website. So we have both in-person and virtual gatherings. We also have a podcast. A podcast is a little bit different because your voice isn't in the room in the same way, but it is a group conversation with it's Jason, who is a pastor, and he's on our board, Lisa, who leads with me, and myself, having basically like a small scripture circle. So that gives a good idea of what kind of conversations we're having, and it's a good place to start. So that podcast is called Searching the Sacred. And then when you do want your voice in the room, which we hope you do, because we think that is the best way to participate, is to have your voice be a part of it, then you can go to our website and see if there's a time that works out to join some of the things that we do.
Great. Is that okay if I drop it in the notes for the
please
podcast? Do. Okay, absolutely. So if this is sounding good to you, please follow up. But there's more I think people would be interested in following up. So tell us a little bit about Enneagram work. I'm interested even in, your connection to that, like how that came about. But I'd love to hear whatever you want to share about that.
Yeah, this Enneagram and 40 orchards overlap in my personal story of when I was in that liminal space of I can't do what I was doing anymore, but I don't know what I'm doing next, which was super messy and hard. I feel like I always want to be gentle talking about these sorts of stories after the fact versus in them, because it can feel so serendipitous and laid out path in hindsight. And it is a beautiful story, but at the time, it was all so painful and so difficult and so unclear. I made a ton of mistakes. I hurt people. Like, it was messy during, and beautiful things came out of it. So as a part of that time, I had been meeting with a spiritual director who introduced me to the idea of the Enneagram. And I found it to be really helpful and really intriguing. And so as I was sort of pondering what to do next with my life, I decided to go seek some training in it. And I went to Chicago and studied with Dr. Jerome Wagner, who has been doing Enneagram for a long time, and was like, all right, I think maybe that'll be a part of my life. And what happened basically is when we then go to 2016, that January moment, I was basically starting a small business and a nonprofit at the same time. Which again, it was just so ridiculous.
Who does that? Yeah.
Both things fail really often. And I was like doing both at one time, which goes to my own Enneagram type. It's called, sometimes it's called tenacity, and sometimes it's called like almost like a recklessness, because I'm a self-preservation 4, for those who are familiar, which has a certain like impulsivity towards like living your truest life that can cause you to cast like planning to the wind and like leave something for the next authentic thing. And anyway, so it's I also see my ego like shining bright how the story took place. And yet here we are and it's become something that I really treasure as a part of my life. It's changed a lot over the time because it's gotten more popular, which in some ways has helped and in some ways has actually made it difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I think in its popularity, there's sort of a pop culture version of Enneagram
True. Yep.
that is a lot of people's inroads. And so I don't actually even want to say that that's bad. I think it's a part of why people know about it as a tool. But I really value kind of using it as a tool. I use that word a lot, where it's not really about finding out what our number is. So Enneagram's a system of understanding human personality that has 9 numbers, and you're one of those 9 numbers. But in the pop culture version, sometimes people are just reading type descriptions and taking tests and figuring out what number they are and stopping there. But Enneagram as a tool and Enneagram in history is actually, once we know our number, that is the beginning of the journey, because that's when we actually get deep insight into how our ego is functioning, how we're living inside of shadow selves, and what it looks like to move into a truer, more whole version of who we're meant to be. What it means to be more aware of our vulnerabilities and fears and stresses, and be more compassionate towards others. I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
fantastic tool in relationships, because
Yeah.
that thing that annoys us about another person, if we can have compassion for where that's coming from,
Mm-hmm.
that makes a huge difference. I end up working with a good bit of teams these days. And
Mm.
because in the business world, everything has changed over the time of the pandemic, and people need
Yes.
new tools for
Yep.
understanding each other and each other's work styles. And so businesses are contacting me like, okay, how can Enneagram help us be
Mm-hmm.
unstuck as an organization? And so I find that it has uh, makes me feel seen in scary ways. I sometimes say, like, we know we have our Enneagram type right when it makes our skin crawl a little bit and it feels like somebody read our journal, because
Mm-hmm.
it's naming some of these deeper truths that maybe we didn't even quite know how to describe. And someone's
Yeah.
describing it for us. And in that
Yeah.
description, it can go, oh, I feel seen. I feel like there's space for me. And I'm being
Mm-hmm.
given a bit of a pathway out of the ways that
Mm-hmm.
makes me stuck, but also being given a vision for some of the ways that my best self can be in here too.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the other place I get, like, I think Enneagram, sometimes people will get stuck on the negatives.
Mm-hmm.
And the negatives are meant to point us towards that wholeness. And so there is
Mm-hmm.
a vision of wholeness that we're shooting for with the tool. It's not meant to just make us feel bad. It's meant to help
Yeah.
us be awake
Yeah.
and aware.
Yeah. So interestingly, so we're neighbors on the not geographically, but on the Enneagram. So I identify as a 5, a sexual 5. And so you're probably thinking in your brain of all the things. I can't really handle all the 27 subtypes. Because for me, it's been such a valuable tool for personal growth, for understanding myself first, and then how I interact with the world, and then like my relationship with my husband and some of my closest friends, and then and going out from there. And I can just see it as a resource for me that I can utilize for a lifetime. And I agree just with that compassion. My experiences, and I don't know if a lot of 5s identify this way, is it wasn't upsetting to find out I was a 5. I actually felt seen. So there wasn't like there's definitely parts of it that I'm like, oh God. But my experience is just like, oh yes, because my type can kind of feel like we're just like weird and aliens. And so to feel like, oh, there's other weird aliens out there, like this is part of like human nature, and I'm not just like this one off. um but thank you for sharing about the Enneagram. If people wanted to, do you do one-on-one coaching still? Do you do that remotely? Like how is that an opportunity for people, or maybe you're not interested in that right now, or
Yeah, I do.
yeah.
What I do is so I have a website, stephaniejspencer.com. And what I have on my website is, like, let's just start with a consultation call that's
Mm-hmm.
free, to say, what are you looking for? How might I be a fit or not a fit? Sometimes
Yeah.
even that call, I just point people like, you know what you really need is just, how about this book? Because there's a lot of
Yeah.
resources out there.
Yes.
Sometimes I
Yeah.
can just be a conduit for, like, I think this resource would really help you right now. And sometimes coaching is the next step for
Yep.
self, or for, I work with some couples where we're kind of understanding both of their
Mm-hmm.
types. And then again,
Mm-hmm.
I do a lot of work with teams. That's probably my primary these days, but I still do work with individuals too. I like all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so you can see those things on the website and then just have a call and then we talk more about it. Or I'm an Instagram, sort of intermittent. I'm still trying to figure out what Instagram looks like in a way I believe in with Enneagram as I talk about
Yeah, I
pop
feel
culture
you.
Enneagram.
Yes, right. Like,
um,
yeah.
so I'm a little intermittent on that as I try to find my way, but that's Beyond Your Number is my handle on Enneagram on Instagram.
Yeah, and it's a great resource. And I love, and I see you have some behind you. Can you talk a little bit about well, I have two questions. So one, what would be if somebody was like, this is really intriguing as an Enneagram coach, what would be like a first step for somebody?
Great question. It probably depends on your learning style a little bit. One first step I would say is sort of take a deep breath and take your time. Don't start with a test. Start by just learning a little bit about what Enneagram is and opening yourself to seeing. And to know that really there can be pressure to like find my type right away, but
Yeah.
the tradition is more of an oral history and a long road. It's not
Yeah.
uncommon to take a while to find your type. And I
Yeah.
would actually say, I don't know if this was true for you. For many fives, actually, they're very slow to type themselves because even as part of being a five tends to be to want to be an expert on something. And so
Yes.
when a tool is new, it doesn't feel like I can type myself until I've read a few books on Enneagram. Whereas I think then once a five does type themselves, they feel pretty secure in it because they've made themselves the expert first. So that's going to be a different journey than
Yeah.
a seven who's got a lot of forward energy to try the next new thing and might take 3 tests and be like, yes, that sounds just like me. And they might be right because their energy is in that
Yeah.
direction of
Yeah.
discovery and exploration and forward. And so different types can take a different amount of time. Sixes can take a long time to type themselves because
Yep.
their doubt is a part of the ego structure.
Yep.
So how do I know
Yep.
for sure this is what my type is? So just be prepared for whatever the journey looks like for you, which might be different than what the journey looked like for your neighbor or your friend who's excited about Enneagram.
Yeah.
So allow the journey to be what it is for you. And then know
Mhm.
like, okay, how do I learn best? How do I open best? Is something like a podcast best for me? Is something like a book
Mhm.
best for me? Is something
Mhm.
like some websites best for me? So a good website to start with, just because it's been around a long time, is Enneagram Institute. That's a part of the work of Russ Hudson and Don Riso, who has passed away, to set up that website. Um, I'm always there are some great new Enneagram teachers out there in the world, but it's always a good rule of thumb to say if I start with people who've been around the block, I know my information is good. One of the things that happens because Enneagram's sort of a crowdsourced tool, does have a governing body, but it's not copyright protected the same way like an MBTI would be, which means there's a lot of people saying whatever they want about Enneagram. So Google searches are a little dangerous
Mhm.
because they can lead you to fantastic sites, but they can also lead you to some like not great information.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so start with a place like Enneagram Institute or some books that
Yep.
have been around for a while and know that information is solid is good maybe before exploring some of the newer things. Um, I think a really great like starter book to Enneagram is The Essential Enneagram by Dr. David Daniels. It has a little test embedded into it and it covers a lot of the foundational work in a really user-friendly way. Um, I also think this is a newer resource, but the Enneagram magazine
Hmm.
came out a few years ago and their first issue is a primer issue. It's meant for people who are new to the Enneagram and it's very visually appealing. They did a great job of sort of having it's good paper quality for people
Mhm.
for whom aesthetics
Mhm.
is important.
Mhm.
That magazine will feel like something you want to take to your couch with a journal and your succulent plant and candle and an artisan coffee. Like if you're
Yes,
that
there you go.
person,
Yeah.
start with Enneagram magazine,
Okay.
issue number 1. And there's some great podcasts out there too, I think. I really like The Art of Growth. They have panel discussions they have some good summary episodes. Like if you go back in their archives to early on, they talk about what Enneagram is. But then what they do is they have panel discussions of each type. And that's a
Mhm.
great way to hear people of a type that you resonate with and notice what conversation do I resonate with most is a great way to kind of narrow those things down. A podcast that's got really deep, solid, good information is Enneagram 2.0. That's what Beatrice Chestnut and Urania Pai is. They're also kind of experts in the field. But that also can feel a little bit more like even calling it 2.0. That's a little less of an intro. That's a little more of a
Yeah. Yeah.
next step kind of podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more. Actually, on my website, I have a list of recommended resources. So
Great.
maybe
We'll
that
put
was a
it to
lot
that.
to
That's
take in.
probably, yeah, which is
Maybe
good.
that
I'm
would be
like
better
making
word
notes
for
for me. Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah. We'll put a link to their website if you're interested in learning more about the Enneagram. Obviously, Steph is a great resource. So click over to their website and learn a lot more. But you created a resource as well. I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk about the journal. They're beautiful, and you've created a journal for each of the different types.
Yeah, I find that my release date, it's funny, my release date for the journals was spring of 2020. So it was not quite the release
Yeah.
that I thought it would be. But I think people, this kind of gets at your question of what it means to be healthy or live a healthy life. I
Yeah,
feel like
we can go
there's a
there.
lot
Sorry.
of there's a lot of things that people like want to do but don't know how. And I feel like things like I want to grow in wholeness. People want that, but they don't know, but
Mhm.
like what's how? I want to be healthier, but how? Like there's like a gap between desire and pathway. And I wrote the journals hoping it would open up a pathway, especially for those who aren't natural journalers or where self-reflection, like part of being a 4 is I can be overly introspective sometimes. And so this is part of my way of being like, well, I will help someone else be introspective, and just turn a bunch of information into questions. So instead of reading a book of there's a, I mean, like in a let's pick another type than what we've been talking about. So type 2 tends to be a helper kind of type. So it does start with a description of a type 2. And that's in there, but then it's also questions about what it is to be that type. So there's a page with words that describe a type and space to say, like, what do I resonate with? What do I not resonate with? What's a word that used to be like me, but I feel like I've grown past? What's something I wish I could be more? So instead of just looking at words, it's asking me to reflect on those words. It's questions like, how much energy am I putting into meeting the needs of others? Am I putting the same amount of energy into meeting my own needs? Um,
Mm,
uh, When have I struggled to trust that things would be okay and responded by asserting control? How has that affected my life?
mhm,
But then on the next page, there's a how is my desire to love and make a difference led towards a positive contribution in the world? So it's questions that are sort of broad in their scope. It's not just how am I feeling? It's just
mhm,
asking us to notice where we are, which does sort of overlap. Now I'm like overlapping that back with 40 Orchards. The first question that God asks humans in the Bible is, where are you?
mhm,
And I feel like that's a part of what something like journaling does is it helps me see where I am. And where I am is the first step in moving forward. Can I see what's true of me right now? Where I am, what I'm thinking about, what I'm feeling in order to kind of help me move from here and see more clearly where I am right now. And then something I get passionate about when I'm thinking about things like what a healthy or whole life looks like is the back of each journal is looking at the stress and security numbers of each type. So part of the Enneagram tool says that the arrows that are connected to us are also part of who we are. And I think that it's really important to do integration work, and to say, there's a way for me to open to the energy of both of those types in a conscious way that helps me be more truly myself. And I think when I think about the word health in general, I think about integration as a big piece of what it means to
mhm.
be healthy. So that's the journals. It's the subtitle is an Enneagram journal to guide you forward with greater wholeness. So that's
I
the
love it.
hope.
And they're beautiful resources. Thank you so much for creating that. And I think it's going to be, yeah. So the timing that came out was like, oh, there's a lot, right? Their pandemic definitely has kind of set us back in quite a different ways. But I think, yeah, I think the future for your journals is very bright as people discover, and that just might, I guess, is part of your story. I think it'll be like kind of a slow burn as it kind of lights fire. So I'm excited for more and more people to use that resource. So your work to me is centered around, yeah, living your healthiest life. So you're engaged like in the spiritual side and asking questions, the enneagram in terms of like knowing yourself, identifying the ego and how it motivates us, because we need to be aware of that, right? Because we all have our ego, and then but just knowing our propensities and knowing our insecurities and knowing how that drives us, so we can see those tendencies, then we can act about it. So much of that is like you just mentioned, about living your healthiest life. Are there other things that you think when you think about like holistic? You just talked about integration. Are there other things when you think about living your healthy life that you think are important?
I think Enneagram, one of the ways that I use it as a lot as a tool is thinking about the head, heart, and gut centers, and that whatever our type is has a primary home base inside of one of those centers. But as human beings, we have all three. And the issue is we're going to tend to default to one, but we really need to be developing all of them. And that there's a health in saying, how's my head? How's my heart? How's my body?
Yeah.
And then also and then when I think about the spiritual work with 40 Orchards, I think about the word that nephesh in Hebrew, which nephesh is in Genesis 2:7, God breathes life into the human and the human becomes a living nephesh. And that is sometimes translated as soul and sometimes translated as creature, because the idea of it is that it's nephesh is who we are, which includes our body and our heart and our mind and our spirit. All of that is our nephesh. And so I think those two things together, I think about nephesh and I think about head, heart, gut, and enneagram as like there's something to really being aware of all the pieces of who we are. And sometimes even knowing that we might find health in a surprising place. So for instance, for me, I've really found so much life in yoga in the past several years, but this past year in particular, and also longer story than is needed, but also in intermittent fasting. But the thing that like surprised me with intermittent fasting that I was like so angry about is intermittent fasting actually like it didn't help me physically as much as it helped me emotionally. And I was like, why?
You're just mad about it.
I was super mad about that. As a four, I want all of my emotional and spiritual healing to come from some sort of mystical mountaintop experience. And I started experiencing like a heart and a spiritual healing through a physical practice of intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
And to just be open and aware that that's sometimes what happens. And the same thing was happening through yoga. I love yoga for a lot of reasons, but it affects my heart as much, if not more than my body. Like it's about a whole centering thing that is happening in me. It's not just about the physical practice. And so that's why that word integration comes up for me a lot. Is in my own experience, I don't always find healing in the places I thought I would find it.
Yeah.
And so, okay. So I found healing through intermittent fasting. I can laugh about that. I can be a little angry, and I can also say, okay, so I'll keep it as a practice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. We talked a little bit before we came on, before we started recording, about kind of like my journey and what I'm doing as a physical therapist, right? I've been really like physical oriented when I think of living healthiest life. And as I go on, it is this integration journey of, and so there's been a slow and probably at times a little faster since this summer of, I just talk more and more and more. And then with my patients, and they're kind of like, this feels like therapy. And they mean like a mental health, like that they're sitting down with a counselor. And it's like, yeah, because if I just prescribe things and I say, you need to do this 3 times a day, every day, or you need to do this 3 times a week, this is behavior change, and habit forming is so mental, right? And emotional, like it's everything factors into it, like the things that are barriers to doing things. I am doing a lot with breath work and what that changes. Like you can do this one physical thing. Oh, where am I breathing? Oh, we're all breathing up from our chest because we're all stressed, we're all anxious, and we're all like, go, go, go. Oh, if I breathe down there, like, whoa, I just like suddenly feel different. Like in my body, I can feel my muscles relax. I can feel like clarity in my head. I don't feel as much anxiousness. And then there's all kinds of science behind how it's changing neurotransmitters and, uh, you know, parasympathetic versus sympathetic system. So it's really interesting to hear like it come from, yeah, from the other perspective. But I think that's where we need to go in health, like because you can have somebody that's like a psychologist, for example, but maybe what somebody needs is they need to be walking every day, right? Or they need to have like be doing something physical, like even art can be like a physical thing that changes in our body, painting, which you paint, don't you? I think, is that something, I don't remember that from college, but
I do. That was a part of my, yeah, I also have an art. I'm sitting in my office, which is also my art studio. That you
uh-huh.
can see that painting right there. I did.
Yeah.
Some of the other ones are actually, I have like a wall over to I have a
Uh-huh.
pegboard wall where I put different pieces. Yeah, I found I did this is a part of that. The Parker Palmer has a quote that I think about with this work of integration that says, in his book, Let Your Life Speak, which is one of my favorites, he says, how long it can take to become the person one has always been.
Yeah.
And for me, art was something that I never stopped drawing when I was a kid. Like my mom talks about, like that's all I wanted to do was draw, to the point where when I was 8 years old, like all I wanted for Christmas was paper, and I got a ream of paper and I like left the rest of the gifts and went to my room to draw on the ream of paper. Um, but my story, I think, is like many, for whatever that thing is when you're a kid, is I never stopped drawing until I did.
Mm-hmm.
And then I really stopped for a long
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
that because it didn't fit in my life. There were other ego things and other trauma things that came into my life that meant that fell away. And as a part of the work I've done over the last 6, 7 years, it just started to come back. And I started to remember how much life I used to find there. And I started going to art again as a place to process um, my emotions, actually, in a lot of ways. Sometimes I draw or paint in response to my emotions, and sometimes I draw or paint
Mm-hmm.
in order to know what I'm feeling. Like I'll
Mm-hmm.
paint something and then I'll look at it and go, oh, look what I
Yeah.
just
Yep.
painted.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
But and sometimes it's terrible, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's beautiful, and
Mm-hmm.
and it's just letting it be a practice in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
noticed I'm actually just in 2022 bringing it around more consciously again, because it got lost a bit
Mm.
during the pandemic, as I think
Okay.
creative work did for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's okay, and to even take that as a season that doesn't have to prescribe that I left art again or failed in some way. It just
Mm-hmm.
wasn't a
Yeah.
season where it was forward, and now I want it
Yeah.
forward again.
Yeah. I'd love to hear any more of what you're willing to share, either or both, about, because you've had like these gaps. You had it as childhood, you had and then you had the gap, and then it came back in adulthood. I'd love to hear more about like that window of like what steps, like what reintroduced you back to that, like what did that look like for you? And then again, now 2022, as you look to be more intentional, because now it's more conscious, like you have more experience as an adult, you're like, this is part of who I am, and oh wait, what happened? It's not there. As I go into 2022, is that how I want it to be? Like and because they might be the same experience or they might be kind of different.
Yeah, it started coming around again when somewhere around the same time period that 40 Orchards was starting, and it was actually
Mm.
um, Rabbi Allen pointed out to me the posture that my son Alex had asked me to draw something for him, and Rabbi Allen was in the room, and he noticed how my posture changed when I started drawing something. And he pointed it out to me,
Oh
and I was like,
yeah.
"Oh, interesting." And so that sort of just opened up the question, because that's the place that art had stayed, was just if I would draw something for somebody else or create something as a gift or that sort of thing. And so what shifted is I started doing art for myself again.
Mm-hmm.
And I bought an art journal in 2017, I think, is when I bought the art journal. And I just started carrying it around with me and just started
Mhm.
sketching things sometimes. And it was just, I
Mhm.
started small. Like I intentionally bought a journal that was like a small, like
Mhm.
index card
Mhm.
size, because that didn't feel like it was pressure. It's just a
Mhm.
little drawing.
Yeah.
And the timing actually felt so serendipitous. And I mean, in hindsight, because I started that in like January, February of 2017. And it turns out my dad suddenly passed away in June of 2017. And that process of getting art back, I think, was really key for me
Mm.
processing that grief, because I had started to open up this other pathway in my heart through the art that then
Mm.
allowed me to also keep using art as a way to process that grief. So I'm super grateful
Mm.
for the timing that of having
Mhm.
reopened the art journal first before he passed away. Um, and then I think, what happens for me is when we get into the realm of instincts with Enneagram, that's the work of Beatrice Chestnut, if anyone's interested in that layer that creates the 27 subtypes. But I'm a self-preservation dominant. So what happens is it makes perfect sense to me that in a time of pandemic, I would make less space for the frivolous.
Mhm. Mhm.
And art is quote unquote frivolous because the self-preservation starts to take over in different ways. Which is
Yeah.
actually then that's what intermittent fasting I think started to heal for me. Is there's a way that the self-preservation instinct, like one of the ways I tell people they might know they're self-preservation dominant is if they always have a water bottle and a snack available. Like I look at my desk sometimes and I have like four different things. Right now I have a tea and I have a water. And I'm almost always like, even if I'm not sipping from it, I'm like touching it. Like I need to know I have, yes. It's not only
Just I
it's
just
not
held up
only
a tea. Yeah, I
self-preservation.
just held up a tea and a water. Yeah.
But I notice like I always like whenever I've gone on like international trips, I become like a team mom who always has a granola
Mm.
bar for everybody,
Mhm. Mhm.
And there's a way that intermittent fasting helped me is helping retrain that instinct to say I always have to be ready, to
Mm.
say no, it's okay actually, like I can be hungry and food will come around, like I don't have to
Mhm.
be. There's a way it
Mhm.
started to loosen that grip, which I think is a part of what is bringing some things like the art back around, because it takes the
Mhm.
self-preservation grip lowering a little bit
Mhm.
to allow other things the space.
Mm.
um, and so I would say that I think that's a part of what sort of was bringing it back
Mhm.
around. I also had a realization last year that I was slipping back into this realm where the art was more for public consumption. Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
still have this hope actually that I started creating a resource, a book perhaps, of Enneagram images, like that
Mm.
people could
Mhm.
meditate on. But
Mm.
there was something that got really stuck about it. And
Yep.
I was like, oh, it's because like all of my art is now back in this realm of for others
Mhm.
instead of just for self and for reflection
Mhm.
and for heart space. And
Mhm.
I need to get back to that.
Mhm.
And if an images book is birthed, that can be 10 years from now. And there's time I
Yeah.
need to get back to
Yeah.
the heart
Yeah.
space.
Yeah. Kind of you first, right? Or self-love, right? Before you like kind of
Yeah.
filling up before you can
Mhm.
uh put things out there. Oh man, it's, as always, like I can keep talking and talking. I want to, for the sake of our schedules and things, and those listening, kind of bring this to kind of wrap it up. But we can always meet again in the future because there's lots to talk about. As we wrap up here, what is something that you wish people knew more about living their healthiest life? So from the Steph Spencer kind of wisdom, as you go through, you're like, dang it, I just had the platform and if I could just tell people like this one thing, I think the world would be a better place, which I don't think is like ego driven. I think it's just that because we do have this unique, and this is why I have this question, right? Is because I think we have this unique perspective. And we talked about that earlier, right? And I think like you being in community and exploring um, spirituality together. So I'd love to hear, yeah, what's something that you wish people knew more about living their healthiest life?
What comes to mind, um, I'm just going to allow this to rise up, even though it's sort of a surprising answer. It's
Mhm.
surprising me that it's what rose up as an instant response to that question, which is to think of time as a circle instead of a line.
Yeah.
There's a way that when we view time as this linear thing, then time gets lost And as time gets lost, we have all this fear of failure. And we
Mm.
have all this fear of what is behind us and what is ahead of us. And it tends to be the thing that makes keeping rhythm so hard, is we feel like we start a New Year's resolution and then, a week in, I've already missed some of the things. And so, oh, well, I might as well not try. And there's a way, like one of the things we study a lot in 40 Orchards is this concept of Sabbath, which is once a week, there's always this stop point. And that stop point is both the end and the beginning. And so this idea that like time is circular gives us this chance to try and fail and try again
Mhm.
in a way that just holds a lot more space, I think, for those deeper questions. Like we can just ask the question. We don't have
Mhm.
to be afraid that it's going to take us on this pathway. It'll just, we'll have another circle to do some things with that question. Or when I think of healthy habits, that sort of sense of like, it's okay. Things will come around again. I have found a lot of space. I actually have a little like weekly calendar that I put up on my wall in the shape of a circle of like, here's how I want to spend my time. So
Mhm.
that when I get to a when I get to the end of a day and I feel like, oh, that didn't happen the way I wanted it to happen, my brain says that's okay. There'll be another Monday.
Mhm.
For me, that just does a lot to change the weight of things, and
Mhm.
changing the weight of
Mhm.
things helps me make better choices.
Mhm.
And helps me, four, I think there's this tendency to just always think that my ideal life is around the corner and that there's
Mhm.
something
Mhm.
missing in me that's keeping me from that. And I think that's why something like changing the weight is important to me, because it's like, oh no, it's not, I missed that, but that doesn't mean something's missing in me. It just
Yeah.
means I got to wait for the next Monday, or, there's just
Mhm.
a way of holding ourselves and our lives and our time that can feel more free.
Mhm.
And I think I want people to feel more free.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. I some things that we just shared highlight to me about the power of changing perspectives, like how just even you can think about the same concept, but if we just think about it just a little bit different, how that can really just open things up so much, and the power of visual things. So you've talked about it in terms of your space, right? Having artwork up, and I'm assuming, but I believe for you that's intentional, right? To have that up in your space where you're kind of creating and writing and, doing, having meetings, or coaching, um, and talking about your calendar, right? So I've decided I'm going to think about it different, but having these things that are kind of like remembrances, like when you determine, oh, I want to do this, to spend time to create an environment that reminds you of things that you're like, oh, I've decided that to be true, because sometimes we forget about that thing that we decided was true. We had that experience and then it's like, oh, was that just, that was then, that's like not still true, or we can just be kind of forgetful. So um I'm definitely going to be thinking about that. Time is circular, not linear. I think we can all relate to the pressure of time. I know I pretty much always feel like I'm at odds with time in our culture, like what our culture believes about time. And so thank you. I'm going to consider that and take that to heart. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and catch up. And I'm just so excited for what you're doing there, rocking things in the Midwest and just working on living your best life and your healthiest life. And thank you for letting us observe that and be blessed by that. And that just bears the influence of that, like that you're letting yourself rub up against people and influence people, and trusting that. It's really wonderful to hear you talk and share in all the ways that you've grown and learned. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for having me. This was a great conversation.
Absolutely. To everyone, may you see the blessing. If today's podcast sparked for you an interest in wanting to lean into these cycles of learning and growing, I would encourage you to consider joining my New Year's theme retreat that will be this coming January 22nd. And it'll be virtually, so it's available worldwide. You can find information for that on theelbertrail.com. Essentially, this is about listening, so creating time and space to listen to where you've been, where you're at, and then to think about where you want to go with intention and trying to boil that down to a word or a theme that can be a center for you around 2022. Now, this is a practice that I've had for about a decade, and I don't consider it a goal. I don't consider it resolutions. It's about just thinking about where I'm at and listening, where I'm at in my life and what I'd like to lean into in terms of growing. So my word for the year for 2022 is curiosity. And so this experience, this retreat, gives me the opportunity to think about where I've been, where I'm at, and then what that can look like. And so there's journaling time, there's embodied time, meaning doing things in your body, listening to your body. So you can do some yoga, some other experiences like that. We'll do a little bit of art experience together. So it's going to be an integrated experience to help you just live that best life, that healthiest life, centered around creating a theme for the year. You'll be doing this adjacent to people, so it's okay to be introverted and want to do your time together. You can share just as you desire. So to register, you can visit theelbertrail.com. This is my main retreat for now that I do annually, but I will be creating other retreats in the future. If you can't make this one on such short notice, but are interested, you can sign up to get emails about upcoming retreats at retreat@theelbertrail.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Lyle Podcast. If you liked what you heard, you can find me on Instagram at the Elbertrail, as well as YouTube, the internet, www.theelbertrail.com. And that's about it. And back here for our next episode of the podcast. Subscribe and leave a nice review if you think it'll be helpful for other people. Only then. Thanks. May you see the blessing.